Domitien Ndayizeye, born May 2, 1953, is a Burundian politician who was President of Burundi from 2003 to 2005. He succeeded Pierre Buyoya as President on April 30, 2003, after serving as Buyoya's Vice President for 18 months. Ndayizeye remained in office until succeeded by Pierre Buyoya on August 26, 2005. Ndayizeye currently serves as head of the National Gathering for Change, RANAC. In 1994 he was appointed Director of the National Intelligence Service by President Cyprien Ntaryamira. In 2004, Ndayizeye proposed a draft constitution to the parliament prior to it being put to the electorate in referendum later in the year. Relations with the Tutsi group were strained, reflected in their boycotting of the legislative session due to consider the proposal. Due to a lack of preparation, the ballot was postponed to late November 2004. Burundi is still trying to emerge from a civil war that began in 1993 when several groups drawn from the large Hutu majority took up arms against a government and army then dominated by a Tutsi elite. The interim government pledged to more equitably share power between the two main ethnic groups. On August 21, 2006, Ndayizeye was arrested in Bujumbura in relation to his alleged role in a coup plot earlier in the year. The Senate lifted his immunity as senator prior to his arrest. He denied the charges against him in court on December 19 and said that he had never dreamed of organizing a coup. In fact, I had given up politics to do business and be with my family. On January 15, 2007, he was acquitted along with former Vice President Alphonse Marie Kadege and 3 other defendants. 2 others were sentenced to long prison terms. During 2010 general elections, as his party representative, he ran for the presidential seat but decided to withdraw from the race together with all opposition parties, after they accused the ruling party of rigging previous councillors' elections. After opposition politician Zedi Feruza was killed during the 2015 Burundian unrest, Ndayizeye and other opposition parties broke off talks with the government of President Pierre Buyoya. Burundi's former president Domitien Ndayizeye has been appointed by the heads of state and government of the African Union member states to the 5th panel of the WISE. Mr. Ndayizeye took over as president from Pierre Buyoya in 2003 and played a key role in Burundi's transition from post-Buyoya era to the current ruling party CNDD-FDD regime that took power in 2005. Former President Domitien Ndayizeye is appointed by the 35th session of the Conference of African Union Heads of State on the proposal of the Burundian government, Burundi's presidency tweeted. The panel of the WISE, PAU, is a critical pillars of the peace and security architecture of the African Union. The panel is composed of 5 individuals who are highly respected African personalities from various segments and have made remarkable contributions towards peace, security, and development in Africa. PAU's mandate is to support the Peace and Security Commission's work specifically in conflict prevention in the continent. Burundi plunged into ethnic civil war few years after gaining its independence in 1962, which led to decades of instability resulting to thousands of people losing their lives. As part of the healing and reconciliation process among the Burundians after the brutal ethnic violence that led to hundreds of thousands losing their lives, the 2000 Arusha agreement that put an end to the civil war in the country recommended for the formation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In 2004, Ndayizeye proposed a draft constitution to the parliament prior to it being presented to the electorate in a referendum later that year, which saw President Pierre Buyoya taking over the office. Domitien Ndayizeye's appointment by the heads of state means he will be able to serve for a 3-year term with effect from February 2022. The first panel was formed in December 2007 and has produced some thematic reports on issues relevant to peace and security such as non-impunity, women and children in armed conflicts and electoral disputes. Members are selected by the chairperson of the O Commission and appointed through a decision of the Assembly for 3-year term renewable once. Domitien Ndayizeye was inaugurated President of Burundi on Wednesday, to lead the second half of a 3-year transitional power-sharing government designed to end 10 years of civil war. I swear to work for the good of all Burundians, to fight genocide and exclusion, and to ensure the respect of human rights, the BBC reported Ndayizeye as saying when he took the oath of office in the Burundi capital, Bujumbura. He takes over from Pierre Buyoya, a Tutsi, who led the country during the first 18 months of the transitional government. Ndayizeye, a Hutu, will rule until presidential elections are held at the end of the transitional phase. Buyoya handed over power under the terms of the Arusha peace accord, signed between Tutsi and Hutu political parties in 2000. The accord was the culmination of 2.5 years of negotiations, led by the late Tanzanian president, Mwalimu Julius Nyerere. The talks resulted in a transitional government that brings together 19 Burundian political parties for the 3-year transition phase prior to democratic elections. Under Buyoya, the government was charged with securing a ceasefire with non-signatories to the Arusha Accord, beginning reformation of the judiciary, administration, and the security services, repatriating refugees and beginning reconstruction of the war-shattered country. Buyoya seized power in 2 coups, in 1987 when he ousted President Jean-Baptiste Bagaza, a Tutsi, recently released from house arrest, and in 1996 when he ousted Sylvestre Ntibantunganya, a Hutu. South African Deputy President Jacob Zuma, the chief facilitator in the peace process, said on Tuesday the transfer of power would be an important landmark and showed how much progress had been made toward peace. "I think the Burundian people should celebrate that we have moved so far," he told reporters shortly after his arrival in Bujumbura. "The last period is going to be more testing because there is nothing that we can leave untouched," he said, "but I think people should be convinced that the Burundians are ready for peace, and now that the peacekeeping force is coming, we must say that the situation is changing." In his speech at the presidential inauguration ceremony, Zuma described the event as a significant step forward. He paid tribute to Buyoya for displaying statesmanship, courage, and patriotism by stepping down from office when the time came to do so. Zuma also saluted former South African President Nelson Mandela, present at the ceremony, who took over as facilitator of the peace process when Nyerere died. "I wish to single out for praise 2 outstanding statesmen who have driven this peace process at different periods, Mwalimu Nyerere and former President Nelson Mandela," Zuma said. "Mwalimu must be smiling upon us today as he sees yet another realization of his dream of restoring peace, stability, and democracy in this country," Zuma added. Not all Burundians are convinced, however, as they say that they have seen many ceasefire ceremonies and inaugurations, but they still live in a state of war. "I don't see this as an important event," Eugene Ndayizeye, a former minister for human rights in Buyoya's government, told IRIN. "There are lots of events like this, but none of them have brought what most Burundians want, an end to the war." While humanitarian organizations in Burundi welcomed the positive steps in the peace process and the renewed international attention that Burundi was receiving, they warned that the humanitarian situation on the ground was still a serious concern. "Today people's eyes are on the political situation, but I think that it is important that we also talk about the people of Burundi as they are suffering extremely from this war," Antoine Girard, the head of the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, said on Tuesday. Burundi has been embroiled in internal conflict for decades, but the UN estimates that the most recent conflict, which was sparked off by the assassination of the first democratically elected Hutu president in October 1993, has left an estimated 300,000 dead and over 1 million people internally displaced or living abroad as refugees. Domitien Ndayizeye, a Hutu of the Democratic Front for Burundi, Front pour la démocratie au Burundi, Frodbu, will take over the presidency of Burundi from Major Pierre Buyoya, on April 30. The new government must deliver on promises to end a 9-year-long war and to deliver justice for the many violations of international humanitarian law committed during the war. The transfer of power, the signing of ceasefires with all but one of the rebel groups, the promised deployment of an African Union peacekeeping force, the passage of laws on justice, and the infusion of foreign aid in recent months have all raised hopes that the new government will succeed better than its predecessor. But other signs are less promising, Combat and violence intensified in recent weeks throughout the country, and the new laws on justice are encumbered with provisions that will slow their implementation. In addition, international donors have not yet fully funded an African Union peacekeeping force essential for monitoring the ceasefire. The transfer of power from Buyoya to Ndayizeye, the second stage stipulated in the Arusha Accords of 2000, involves a complex balancing of ethnic and political interests. Ndayizeye, who was vice president under Buyoya, will have a Tutsi vice president, Alphonse Kadej of the Union for National Progress, Union pour le Progrès National, UPRNA. In certain areas, such as security, Kadej's signature will be required to validate Ndayizeye's decisions, leaving the Tutsi UPRNA with power to block decisions by the new government. Frodba did not enjoy similar power under Buyoya. Ndayizeye has pledged every effort to obtain a total and permanent ceasefire. The government previously signed ceasefires with several rebel groups, the most important of which was the December 3, 2002 agreement with the major branch of the National Council for the Defense of Democracy Forces for the Defense of Democracy, Conseil National pour la Défense de la Démocratie Forces pour la Défense de la Démocratie, CNDD-FDD. The parties to the December 3 ceasefire agreed to stop all incitement to ethnic hatred, an important measure in this war in which political leaders have exploited anger and fear between the majority Hutu and minority Tutsi. They agreed also to halt all acts of violence against the population, including killings, torture, the use of child soldiers, and sexual violence. But the agreement left many major issues unresolved, such as the cantonment of rebel forces, demobilization, integration of the rebel forces into the national army, the timing of deployment and nature of the forces to be provided by the African Union, the role of the CNDD-FDD in the political institutions. Soon after the signing, both sides violated the ceasefire, each blaming the other for the violations. The government and the CNDD-FDD signed a new pledge renewing the ceasefire on January 27, but it has been equally disregarded by both sides. Another armed group, the National Liberation Forces, Forces Nationales de Libération, FNL, never agreed to a ceasefire and also continues combat. In the months of March and April, government and rebel forces have fought in the provinces of Bujumbura City and Bujumbura Rural, Bubanza, Muramvya, Gitega, Ruyigi, Rutana, Makamba, and Kayanza. In the course of this fighting, as in the previous 9 years, civilians have been massacred, raped and otherwise injured, and forced to leave their homes, which are often looted and destroyed. High-ranking military officials have warned civilians that any who do not flee rebel forces will themselves be treated as rebels. In a recent trial of officers accused of participating in the deliberate massacre of 173 civilians in Itaba Commune, Gitega Province, the military prosecutor called civilians present in a community after the passage of rebel secondary assailants, thus ignoring the distinction between combatant and non-combatant that is fundamental to international humanitarian law. On April 23, in one of the most recent incidents of military attacks on civilians, soldiers reportedly intentionally shot some 20 civilians fleeing combat in Kabazi Commune, Bujumbura Rural. In several of the most serious massacres documented by Human Rights Watch, government soldiers have escaped all meaningful. The most flagrant recent example of virtual impunity for massive civilian killings was the decision of a military court to sentence 2 officers to 4 months of prison in the Itaba massacre mentioned above. The original charges of murder were reduced to lack of public solidarity, but the officers were finally convicted of having failed to follow orders by not having reported the situation accurately. They were not sanctioned for the killings themselves. Because they had spent 5 months in jail awaiting trial, they were immediately released and resumed their military duties. Beginning April 17, FDD forces shelled the capital city of Bujumbura and provincial capitals at Gitega and Ruyigi. Most of the shells fell in residential areas or the town center, not on military targets. At least 6 civilians were killed and 43 wounded in these attacks, which appear to have violated international humanitarian law. A FDD spokesman said that the objective of these attacks was to put pressure on the government to resume negotiations. Both FDD and FNL forces have summarily executed civilians, some of them local administrative officials and others, unarmed passengers in vehicles that have been ambushed on various roads throughout the country. Rebel forces have also raped and injured civilians, and they have destroyed and looted civilian property, all violations of international humanitarian law. In recent months, the FDD has continued to recruit children for military service. Neither of the rebel forces has announced any form of accountability or discipline for combatants guilty of violating international humanitarian law. In combat zones, government troops have barred access by humanitarian agencies, leaving displaced persons without adequate food, water, or medical assistance. In the eastern province of Ruyigi, where thousands of persons are displaced, military commanders have allowed only occasional and limited aid deliveries since the third week of January. The Geneva Conventions, to which Burundi is a party, specify that a state engaged in a civil war should facilitate deliveries of humanitarian assistance to the civilian population by impartial agencies. In mid-April, Burundian radio stations reported that government troops engaged in skirmishes in Bujumbura with armed groups of young bandits who did not appear to be linked to any rebel group. A rise in such banditry would increase the suffering of civilians and complicate the problems of restoring order. With combat continuing, Burundian legislators have nonetheless passed several laws important for delivering justice under the new government. Both the Assembly and the Senate adopted a long-promised law against genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Passage of the law marks a major step in this country that has seen large-scale ethnic slaughter in the past, but the law is encumbered with a complicated mechanism that may delay dealing with these crimes. It calls for an international judicial commission of inquiry, presumably to be created under the aegis of the United Nations, to examine crimes committed from 1962 until the date of promulgation of the law, a period of more than 40 years. It also asks for an international criminal tribunal to be created to try cases of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity if the Commission finds that such crimes have been committed. This implies that the Commission would be free to disregard the findings of a previous UN Commission that reported to the Security Council in 1996 that genocide had been committed in Burundi. The law provides also that national jurisdictions could try such crimes and that they should be staffed with regard to ethnic balance, a standard which is both vague and, given the relative lack of Hutu jurists, probably unworkable in the immediate future. The death penalty could be applied to those found guilty, in contravention of prevailing international norms and the practice of existing international tribunals. The Assembly also proposed establishing a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to cover the same period since 1962, resisting efforts to limit its mandate to examining several specified events. It is unclear how this commission will function, both in relation to the International Judicial Commission of Inquiry and the regular judicial system. The Assembly also authorized ratification of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. In the past, the government indicated its intention of making use of Article 124 of the treaty, which permits a state to delay accepting the competence of the court for 7 years for certain crimes. It did not raise this issue at the time of Assembly approval but might introduce it when the matter is considered by the Senate or at some stage later in the process. The legislature did not adopt proposed measures for decentralizing and increasing the number of both civilian criminal courts and military courts. Such measures could well have had immediate impact in increasing the efficiency and improving the quality of justice delivered. In the last year, Burundian authorities have arrested and otherwise harassed journalists, in violation of national and international guarantees of press freedom. They shut down Net Press, a web-based information service, for 2 months in early 2002, accusing it of undermining national unity. Police detained and beat a journalist of Studio Ijambo in March 2002 after he had covered a meeting of a radical Tutsi group. Authorities also detained and interrogated journalists from African Public Radio in Ruyigi in May 2002 after they had reported military abuses, and they harassed journalists from this same station in March and April 2003 after further broadcasts about military attacks on civilians. In March 2003, President Buyoya summoned journalists to inform them that they must not allow rebels to speak on the radio. In what may have been an effort to intimidate the outspoken director of African Public Radio, armed men killed the guard at his home in February 2003. A proposed press law was tabled in the last meeting of the Assembly and sent back to the Council of Ministers, thus delaying establishment of stronger guarantees of press freedom. The special representative of the UN Secretary-General and regional leaders preside over a number of diplomatic initiatives to end the war, but the actual work of peacekeeping is to be handled by a mission of the African Union, a first for the newly constituted organization, formerly the Organization of African Unity. 43 observers attached to the mission have arrived from Tunisia, Burkina Faso, Gabon, and Togo and are deployed in several towns, although they are not traveling to combat zones for security reasons. More than 100 South African troops arrived in Bujumbura on April 27, part of a larger peacekeeping force of 3,500 soldiers that will include soldiers from Mozambique and Ethiopia. The mandate of the force is only to monitor the ceasefire, leaving it unlikely that its soldiers will even endeavor to protect civilians. As yet, the force has no unit specially tasked with monitoring the human rights situation. The European Union recently pledged €1.23 million, $1,100,000, and Belgium promised another €1 million, $900,000, to pay for the African mission. The United States will provide some equipment and training. The amounts pledged until now are far short of what will be needed to deploy a force throughout Burundi. Quick to join in diplomacy to help end the war in Burundi, international donors now need to provide the funds needed to help implement the accords on the ground. Thank you for watching this video.